Welcome to this webinar on positive psychology in a time of pandemic. I'm Miriam Akhtar and I am in the southwest of England in Bristol, and I'm joined by
Johnstone. I'm living in the northeast of Scotland, and I've been working with Miriam, I think it's about 12 years now, a dozen years. I used to live in Bristol before I migrated up north. And so yes, we've been doing this. I think we're approaching our 9th time that we've run a free webinar leading also into our eight-week course. Miriam, back to you.
So we'd like to welcome you as well. So if you haven't already done so, please do add your name and where you are to the chat box, which is on the long black bar. For most people, it's at the bottom of the screen if you're on a PC, but for those on Apple or Mac, I think it's at the top of your screen, and this is the place to ask questions as well. So while one of us is presenting, the other one will be monitoring the chat box as we go. So we've muted you now, and I think in terms of tech, I think that's probably all you really need to know. You will see the screen and we'll swap between the two of us sharing our presentations, and there will be a copy of the recording afterwards that we will post on Rizuku, which is where we've been hosting, or we are hosting, a 4-week introductory course to positive psychology. So let's have a look at the shape of the webinar. So our theme for this evening is positive psychology. What is there of value, of use in positive psychology that can help us in this time of pandemic? We'll start with some introductions to Chris and myself. Then Chris is going to talk about the growth mindset, linking it to the free course that we're running and picking up on a couple of the questions that have come up there. Then I'm going to be introducing 2 forms of positive coping. Let's get my laser pen up. Then it'll be back to Chris for a section on loneliness in the pandemic. And then I'm going to finish off with some content on the silver lining in the pandemic. What might be the silver lining in the pandemic? Something called post-traumatic growth, how we grow through adversity. And finally, we'll be introducing the 8-week online course that Chris and I will be delivering for the 9th time, which starts on the 27th of January. So let's kick off with some introductions and to meet the trainers. So there we are, myself and Chris Johnstone. We both run little companies. I run positive psychology training, and Chris runs the College of Wellbeing. I've been a practitioner of positive psychology now for over 10 years. I think it's about a dozen years. It's about the same length of time that I've been working with Chris. I qualified on the first European program in positive psychology at the University of East London. And I work as a coach, trainer, consultant, speaker. I'm also a visiting lecturer in positive psychology at the University of Lisbon. I design well-being courses, programs, and well-being at work programs. I think I now have the 7 ages of mankind or humankind covered, programs ranging from positive youth up to positive aging. I've also noticed an increasing demand for resilience training, and over the last 5 years or so, I've done a lot of resilience training for frontline medics. And with Chris, we delivered a Train the Trainer program for trainers at the Defence Academy to help them roll out a resilience program across the UK military. I've also the author of 3 books in positive psychology. There's the Little Book of Happiness, Positive Psychology for Overcoming Depression, which helps people recover their well-being. And there's been a study published that compares this book to to CBT, and found that positive psychology works as well as CBT in helping people recover from depression and improve their mental health. And my other book is Post-Traumatic Growth, which I'll be talking about later on. I've also contributed to the World Book of Happiness. This was the result of an invitation that went out to 100 global happiness experts. And it's a book that was given to 200 world leaders with a request to put well-being on their national agenda. Also got a chapter in its follow-up, which is the World Book of Hope. And I've contributed to other series of books as well, including the Real series of books from Psychologies magazine. I'm one of the featured experts in Real Calm. And I also wrote a chapter in Gratitude, How to Appreciate Life's Gifts. So that's me. And you can find me at positivepsychologytraining.co.uk or on social media at Pos Psychologist. And I'm going to hand over to Chris now so you can share your presentation and tell us more about you.
Thank you, Miriam. So I'm just moving over to a screen share here, and just going to just introduce myself too. That as Miriam said, I've got a medical background, and I trained in the 1980s, and I was very lucky to be mentored by one of the pioneers of the holistic approach to healthcare, Patrick Pietroni. And a group of us, we set up a we're part of the British Holistic Medical Association, where we felt that there was something out of balance with our medical training, that it was very much focused on the things that could go wrong, but much less attention to what does it look like when things are going well. And so we set up a complementary program, really. This was back in the early and mid 1980s. And I was also very interested in resilience, self-help strategies that help people deal with difficulty, which I used a lot when I qualified as a doctor, and also needed myself when I went through very harrowing years as a junior doctor. This was back in the 80s. I had a kind of burnout experience. I actually fell asleep driving and crashed my car. And Miriam mentioned earlier the phrase post-traumatic growth. And I feel that part of my training for this kind of work is my own experience of adversity, my own bumpy times, but also, as well as the downslopes, they got me very interested in the upslopes. I think of it as the inspirational dissatisfaction, and I think many of you might find this too, that it's your own experiences of health challenges that have been important stepping stones and provokers of your interest in well-being. And so when I left medicine for a while, I trained in a wide range of psychological therapies, including positive psychology, and I became involved in the addictions treatment work and worked in mental health for many years. And I used and drew upon positive psychology in my work as a medical doctor in mental health services in the British National Health Service. And particularly in addictions recovery, it's like when people stop using chemicals in terms of drugs or alcohol as ways of dealing with distress, and that they need something else to turn to. And so a lot of my work was saying, well, when you have a crisis, what else can you do other than use drink or drugs? And that was really where my work with resilience training has really deepened. It's something I've written a book about, 7 Ways to Build Resilience. And that's really my main work now, is resilience training. I noticed Diana in the group was from Lebanon. I was had the privilege of working with Lebanese mental health workers over the summer in the weeks leading up to and also after the explosion in Beirut and in August. And it was a real test of the value of this kind of material. And the group who went through this, including Dana, one of the people in the group who had her home destroyed in that explosion, saw that the training that we'd been doing together was preparation for the difficult time that they went through in a way that helped them make a better, that it resourced them to respond. And so when we look at positive psychology in a time of pandemic, I really want to look on that's really the question we're holding today: positive psychology in a time of pandemic. And want to recognize that this webinar is part of a larger offer. It's part of a larger course that on Rizuku, that's our online learning platform, we've got a free online course. And if there's questions you have that you don't get a chance to ask or get responded to in this webinar, do join the online resource. You can see both of our websites at the bottom of this slide, minecollegeofwellbeing.com and Miriam's at Positive Psychology Training Co UK, and at either of those websites you can see a link to join the free online course. And I wanted to pick up a few questions from that, and also wanted to pick up Sana's question, which is actually in the chat box here, and I managed to speedily nab it and take it onto the slide. So I want to see these questions as really as our starting point for this webinar. And Yazia, hi, any tips on maintaining psychological stability and positive mindset during the pandemic, despite all the current challenges? So how can we do this in spite of that? And Abby asking, I'd like to ask how I can use positive psychology homeschooling my children during lockdown. And so a lot of what we're going to be looking at, you can apply with adults, you can also apply with children. And there's been a lot of research around offering resilience interventions to school-age children after depression and finding that that's a helpful intervention, reducing the risk of depression and anxiety. And then I want to just touch on Sana's question. My question is how to find a spark or light when everything seems hopeless. So that's the backlog, the background, the context really that I want to speak to. And so it's kind of, here's us facing this. And I want to ask you just to reflect on a question. See if you can think of a time when you struggled with something and perhaps thought that it might never improve, but it did. Just think of that sequence. I'm sure, I'm guessing that all, or certainly most of you, will have had that experience, a time when you struggled with something. And you might even have a sense of yourself as like, you know, here I am, I can't change it. This is how things are, you know, even that phrase, if it's not in the picture, it's not going to happen. But you somehow chipped away at something and it did change. And I'm going to ask you, what helped you do that? And also, what strengths did you use? And in reply to that previous question about from Abby about how can you apply positive psychology in homeschooling children, I think one of the things is, what kind of conversations do we have? And if we can have a conversation that both names challenge, but also names the positive responses to challenge, and then looks at how we can build on and develop our ability to have positive responses to challenge. So that question really saying, you know, when have you struggled with something, thought that it might never improve, but it did? And what we're looking at here, and this is a shift from seeing things as a fixed picture to more like frames in a movie film, is the difference between what psychologists call the fixed mindset and the growth mindset. So the fixed mindset is we are a particular.
Hello, Chris. I think you've muted yourself.
I think, did you mute everyone? Anyway, I'm back. I'm back. And so this is in resilience, one of the things I say, there's what happens and there's what happens next. So what happens is, I got muted just for a moment. What happens next is we notice and we took corrective action. And so this idea of seeing life as a process of things happen, whether it's become muted or we have a challenge, and we're going through a really big challenge right now. And in terms of well-being, sometimes people think, I'm a well person or I'm not a well person. What we're going to be doing is applying the growth mindset, this idea that we can grow our capacities. We're going to apply that to well-being, seeing well-being as a direction you can move in from any starting point. And on the online course, we've got 4 topics, 4 themes. And we can apply the growth mindset to every one of them. So the first week, we're really asking, what is positive psychology? But we're also looking at how you cultivate positive emotions. In the second week, we're focusing on strengths and really applying that growth mindset to how do we grow our strengths? One of the ways we grow our strengths is by noticing when we use them, drawing attention to them, really giving our attention to them, and then also intentionally using them more. It's a bit like our physical muscles. When we exercise them, they grow stronger. And it's the same with our inner strengths as well. So just here's a question. I can't see your hands here, but sometimes you can do responses. I'm not sure if you can, or you can just write in the chat window. And I'm wondering how many of you have drawn on strengths more over the last year, that you've been tested in a way that you've needed to use strengths, maybe even strengths you didn't know that you had. And maybe just write some of those examples in the chat window, if you've had a chance to use strengths that you hadn't. So just really holding that question. So I'm seeing that there are some hands up from Christina, Nikki, Harm, Carly, and I'm sure many others too. So we're on a journey really applying the growth mindset to these different areas. These are the 4 topics in our free course, and in our more in-depth course that starts at the end of January. We have 8 topics that we look at where we apply the growth mindset to every one of them. Look at, say, how can you develop this? How can you cultivate this? And want to if we see well-being as a direction you can move in from any starting point, including being at a low ebb. So that question really about how can we light a spark when things seem hopeless? See that as the beginning of a story, and then saying, okay, what's the direction I want to move in? And then what are the steps that I take? We're particularly looking at this idea of choice points where I'm more moving this way or that way. And then also looking at one of the choice points is to develop our strengths. I'm just seeing that greater tolerance is a strength that Janet has gained access to in this time of pandemic. And a term that some of you may have heard is the corona coaster. We are like a roller coaster. There's ups and downs in this, but those ups and downs, whenever we're down, it's like saying, okay, what will help me here? If I was to apply the growth mindset, and an image I use a lot, and it's a really kind of central image to the training we do, is to see well-being as a bit like rowing in a boat. We have times when we're rowing along merrily, but also times where we crash. And this may be familiar to any of you who've worked with me around resilience or well-being, where this idea of it's not just the rocks we crash into, but it's also our water level. And what we're doing with well-being training, with positive psychology training, is really holding the question, what lowers our water level? And the challenges of the pandemic, certainly there's lots there, the great uncertainties we face, the financial challenges we face, the loss of people close to us perhaps, and also the fear that we may get ill or have got ill. And what we're looking at with positive psychology foundations is what we give to that, how we respond to that. And each of these foundations we're looking at as upward arrows, and we can apply the water level more generally to well-being. but we can also apply it to each of the sub areas, the themes of well-being. We can say, okay, what improves my strengths? What are upward arrows that help me grow my strengths? What are upward arrows that help me grow my resilience? What are upward arrows that nourish my relationships? So that's our theme, resourcing ourselves. And I'm going to hand over to Miriam, who's going to look more. Well, over to you, Miriam. I'm guessing you're also going to be looking more at what does resource us, but over to you.
Thank you, Chris. So if you could can I stop you?
I've stopped
Thank
sharing.
you.
And over to you.
Right. So there's been lots of comments coming in, which hopefully you'll be able to scroll through. Lots of examples of things that have helped to feed our reservoir of resilience. So I'm going to introduce two forms of positive coping that can really help us right now dealing with the corona coaster. So the question for you, what are you consuming right now? You know, what are you feeding yourself? So this is really a suggestion to watch your diet. So I'm not referring to what you put in your mouth, though. Of course, there's lots that you can eat which will support your physical immunity. What I'm talking about here is what you feed your mind. And I worked in the media before I got into positive psychology, and I'm very aware of the power of the media to influence our mental health. And most news media is based on the belief that sharing negative stories and sensational stories will attract people's attention, and this will translate into ratings and clicks, which will then attract the advertisers. We do know that what's wrong is strong. So our brains are wired to really notice what's wrong in the world, and this triggers a stress response as well. So not only do we notice the negative more easily than we notice the positive, but also emotions are contagious. They spread. So if you're consuming alarmist media, not only will it raise your own levels of anxiety, but that's going to spread to the people you're in contact with. So emotions, like viruses, are contagious. So this is really an invitation to give yourself a digital detox, so have regular breaks from the news media and bring your focus on to the positive. So what we know is that when we focus on the positive, when we focus on developing positives in our lives, not only is it good for our mental health, but it's also good for our physical health as well. Frequent experience of positive emotions are associated with lots of benefits for our physical health, not only our psychological health. So finding ways to do things that make you feel good, and we've got some little examples. Well, and I'll go back to those in a second, but doing the things that make you feel good produces positive emotion, and this is associated with lower levels of stress, higher levels of some of the happy hormones like dopamine, oxytocin, opioids, the sort of pain relieving hormones, and best of all, I just particularly want to draw your attention to this, experiencing positive emotions enhances immune system functioning. So this is a way that we can protect ourselves against the virus, is by doing things that make us feel good. So lots of other benefits as well. But just to go back to what are some of the things that we can do right now to build our feel good factor? Well, asking yourself the question, what is there to be grateful for? Of course, a lot has been lost with the pandemic, but what still remains that we can be grateful for? and what's being gained. You know, what are the positives that have come out of the pandemic? So reflecting on what is good in my life right now, hunting the good stuff, you know, looking around your environment for something that's good, reflecting on what you have in your life that's good. That's something that can help to generate positive emotions, and also savoring the positive. Yes, our lives are under great restrictions at the moment, but when you're sort of privy to something that's positive, like a lovely smell or something beautiful in your environment, be present to it, savor it. It really helps to use your senses so that you can really connect to that positive experience and maximize the positive emotion. So practicing gratitude and savoring are two ways that we can build our experience of positive emotions. I'd like to introduce you also to another way of two forms. So the first, there are two sort of forms of emotion focused coping, and two forms of positive coping. First of which is emotion focused coping. So gratitude, savoring the positive, that all helps to build positive emotion. And emotion focused coping is about soothing ourselves. It's about helping us deal with the emotional fallout of the crisis and deal with the emotional pain. So that's emotion focused coping. And the other form of positive coping that I'd like to draw your attention to is problem focused coping. So this is identifying the problem and taking steps to resolve it. So this aims to modify the source of the stress directly. So emotion focused coping, one form of emotion focused coping is the emotional first aid of soothing yourself, you know, ways of switching off the stress response, which is the sympathetic nervous system, and activating the body's brake, which is when we're in a state of rest and digestion. This is activating the parasympathetic nervous system. So we can do this by going to the body. That's my recommendation for first aid, emotion focused coping. Go to the body. Breathing exercises. There are all kinds of breathing exercises that can settle us, that can soothe us, take us back into the parasympathetic nervous system. Exercise is another one. Massage, seeking social support, you know, turning to friends and family, and self-compassion. And I want to particularly draw your attention to this, being kind to ourselves, taking the pressure off ourselves, easing up, resting, cutting yourself some slack. It's very easy to be quite hard on ourselves, particularly when we're being tested as we are right now. So just ask yourself, is this good enough? And avoid perfectionism. I know Chris likes to talk about the crap channel, the negative voice that undermines us. So just try and talk to yourself positively and ask yourself, what would a good friend say? There's this lovely self-compassion exercise that comes from Kristin Neff, who's one of the kind of big experts. She's one of the leading researchers in self-compassion. She's really put it on the map. And you might want to join me in with me as I sort of talk you through this. So how you take a self-compassion break. This can be done in a matter of minutes. So firstly, tell yourself, this is a moment of suffering. Ouch. This hurts, this is stress, and that suffering is a completely normal part of life. You know, other people feel this way. You know, we have a community in this. You know, you're not alone. Other people are suffering too. And then put your hands over your heart, feel the warmth and gentle touch of your hands and use a soothing touch. You might stroke your hands, for example. So do something to soothe, to physically soothe yourself. And say, you know, be kind to yourself. You might ask yourself, what do I need to hear right now to express kindness to yourself? There might be a phrase that speaks to you in particular. May I give myself the compassion that I need. May I learn to nurture myself as I am. May I be strong and may I be perfect. So that's just an example of a form of emotion-focused coping. And I'm very quickly going to introduce you to a form of problem-focused coping. So problem-focused coping is about dealing with the source of stress directly. And this is appropriate sometimes after we've done the emotion-focused coping. So when we're in the stress of the pandemic, when we're in overwhelm, that's where emotion-focused coping is really helpful, helps us to process those emotions, you know, for example, having a cry, leaning on friends. But problem-focused coping is something to do when you've settled those emotions. And this helps us to come up with a realistic action plan to help us move forwards, tackle the problem that we're dealing with. Now, something that's really helpful for this is acceptance and commitment therapy. This is a form of therapy that uses mindfulness techniques to help us sort of accept the reality of our experiences and choose an action to take us forward. So we can use the 3 letters in the acronym ACT and use this as something to guide us. So the A, accept the reality of the COVID crisis. So, you know, what can you do right now? What can you do that's under your control? Then consider and commit to what's important to you. What's your priority right now? And then finally, take the action that's within your control. So ACT can help us. It's a form of problem-focused coping. So 2 forms of positive coping, and I'm going to hand over to Chris now for our next section.
Thank you, Miriam. Just unmuting myself. And I really like this and use this acceptance and commitment therapy ACT. Within the field of the approach or tradition of acceptance and commitment therapy, they quite often say it's not ACT, it's ACT. But something I say to myself, and this thing Miriam mentioned, self-talk, you know, what are the phrases we say to ourselves? One of them, I just say to myself, I say, when I'm struggling, Chris, ACT. So acceptance is there's what happens. And commitment is what happens next. Commitment is what we can bring to what happens next. And so I'm accepting that we're a large group holding this question together of what is positive psychology in a time of pandemic? What does it look like? And also picking up on some of the comments and questions in the chat window. So Gehain saying, all these methods are good steps if you are ready. And I think what you're drawing attention to is that we can vary in how ready we are. Sometimes we're more ready and we're more able, and sometimes we're less ready and less able. And that's also true of the people we're working with. And so one of the things I do myself, I often say, what's the smallest step I can take from here? What's the smallest step that is a step? And this thing also about, well, how do I encourage myself? How do I encourage myself to take steps? But also what's in the way and how can we deal with those? And so I'm going to move on to another, we're on a journey through different areas, and I'm going to share my screen, and where what Miriam is already really drawing attention to are some of these upward arrows in terms of how we resource ourselves. So when I'm facing any of the challenges in this pandemic, what helps me? What helps me is, and you'll have some that help you too. And I've also noticed in the chat window, some of you are writing in your favorite responses. What I want to turn to is the resilience challenge of loneliness. And I'm just really inviting you to write in the chat window if this is something that you've experienced, if you've experienced some loneliness to a degree where it's been an issue, where you've been more alone than you'd like to be, or that you're close to someone else who is. It might be a family member or a friend, someone who's come up in your mind where you're concerned about them being alone in this time. So just invite you just to acknowledge that in the chat window, if that's true for you. Just and some of what I'm going to say is specifically about loneliness, and some of it is going to be more generally about how we respond to a resilience challenge. And so there's some number of mentions of isolation and loneliness. Are they the same or different? And I think that even when we're isolated, we're not always necessarily lonely. And sometimes we can not be isolated and we can be lonely. In my resilience researching for when I was writing my resilience book, I interviewed people. And one of the people I interviewed facing extraordinary challenges was Peter Shaw. And Peter Shaw was kidnapped in Georgia, Eastern Europe, and held in an underground cell for months and months. It was kind of basically sensory and social isolation. And I asked him, I said, like, what helped you? So here's me facing this. What helps is, I said, this is extraordinary situation. What helped you? And one of the things that he did was that he remembered people who'd been close to him in his life, particularly family members, and kind of recalled his past experiences with them. And then he composed a speech to them, and then in the evening he'd give his speech. And there's something really important here, is that in a way he's doing a strategy, a really advanced form of a strategy that we'll look at. He's using his memory and imagination to make contact with a support network even when there's no one physically there. And so when we look at positive psychology foundations, there's what happens, which is, the experience, in this case, experience of loneliness. But what happens next? That involves choices. That involves, as Miriam identified, emotionally focused coping. What helps me cope with the experience of aloneness, but also problem solving, which may be more about reaching out to others. And I wanted to bring in here the work of John Cacioppo, who is one of the world's leading researchers on loneliness. And what I'm really impressed by, or feel is so important about John Cacioppo's research, is it's not just about the experience of loneliness, but it's also about constructive responses. And what he talked about was this acronym EASE. And the first E stands for to extend yourself. And so if you are feeling alone, it's like, well, who can I reach out to? Who can I lean towards? Who can I make contact with? And really picking up Gahane's point that some of this is easier to do when you're ready, and there's all kinds of obstacles in the way. But if we see developing our social network as something that's even more important when it's challenged, there's a great saying, the roots of a tree grow longer and stronger in the drought. And it's at times where we really need our connections that we can take on as a project, developing them, nourishing them, cultivating them. So this first E is extending yourself. And what Peter Shaw is a really great example of is that you can extend yourself in your memory, through your memory and through your imagination, as well as physically making contact with people. You can hold in your mind the people who've been important to you in a way that what you're doing is
It's like a banging tackle, isn't it?
So I'm just going to ask you to mute yourself if your voice is coming through. And what we may do is just mute everyone just in a moment. I'm just going to do that. So it's interesting talking about making contact, but I'm also reducing contact by muting people. But there's also something here about, I talked earlier about active hope. The idea of, if you hope for more contact, how can you be active in making that more likely and developing an action plan? And you might kind of think, well, this is all common sense, but common sense isn't always common practice. And what I find with acronyms like this is that they're ways of nudging myself to do the things that I need to do. And so developing some kind of action plan. And if you're supporting someone else who's lonely, you might ask if they'd be interested in having a structured approach to tackling their loneliness, in the same way that you might have a structured approach to dealing with other health challenges, whether it's your diet or exercise or other areas. And in our online course, the more in-depth one, we look more closely at having a structured approach to nourishing your relationships more generally. And there's something here also about the third one, is seek collectives. It's kind of thinking, where do I use the term us? Where do I use the term we? Where do I have something in common with other people? It might be, us people who are interested in, or us people who are members of a family or a group. And then it's like saying, well, how do I reach out to the people I share something important with? Or how do I connect with groups where I can feel a sense of belonging? Aware of my mum, 87, living alone, someone I feel concern about sometimes. And I'm really struck by, she's has a number of hobbies. One of them is collecting stamp boxes, boxes that people put stamps in. And she's got a network of people that they've been doing meetings through Zoom, and in a way that I really quite striking. So where do I use us? Where do I use we? How do I reach out to those? But then also, just that last E is really about, one of the hurdles to making contact is our fear about how people might respond. And this idea of expect the best. We might not always get it, but if we kind of think, well, okay, what's the best that can happen here? And how do I make that more likely? One of the ways I make it more likely is by playing my part in the story of making contact. So I'm really just holding an example of a resilience challenge and really applying perhaps the problem-solving approach, but also some emotionally focused coping in there too. This kind of saying, well, okay, how do I be part of a story of addressing the things that I bump into and find difficult? I'm going to pass over to Miriam for the next installment of our journey together. And I'm going to stop sharing to free up the screen over to you. Over to you, Miriam.
Thank you, Chris. And right, so I am going to share now what I hope will be the silver lining. So looking forward to a time beyond the corona crisis, and introducing an area of positive psychology, which is known as post-traumatic growth. And this is what you could call transformational resilience, how life's tough times, the COVID crisis, can not only test us, but it can actually transform us as well, so that we can emerge like a butterfly out of the chrysalis from the crisis. So post-traumatic growth is about the positive personal changes that can result from the struggle with dealing with the trauma and its consequences. So people talk about 3 types of positive change that they experience on the other side of crisis. So they talk about changes to themselves, feeling stronger than they did before. They talk about changes in their relationships, positive changes in relationships, and also changes in their philosophy of life, their world view. So post-traumatic growth, and a lovely quote here that explains it really well. It's through this process of struggling with adversity that changes may arise that propel the individual to a higher level of functioning than which existed prior to the event. So we can emerge stronger in ourselves than we were before the crisis. And there are five types of benefit that people say they experience in adversity. So greater personal strength, having a better understanding of who we are, feeling more authentic, and because we have this feeling of knowing who we really are, that means we're going to be more resilient in future because we understand ourselves better. And then there's having a fresh appreciation of life. Going through the crisis of corona acts like a wake-up call. So it leads to us having a fresh appreciation of life and gratitude for what we have. So returning to that mention of gratitude. And also new priorities and possibilities. After the endings come new beginnings, and it changes us. It changes what we want out of life. We might go in a new direction. And also, just following up on what Chris was saying about loneliness, one other positive outcome that people report on the other side of crisis is better relationships, having closer, more warmer relationships, a sense of community and greater compassion for others as well. And one other benefit is spiritual growth. So having a deeper sense of meaning and purpose in life, and a stronger sense of spiritual connection. So it might be via the religion you grew up with, or a faith that you found later on in life, but it also might be feeling a connection to nature or something else beyond the self that's rich and meaningful for you. So here's a question for the chat box. What positives have you noticed as a result of the pandemic? What aspects of post-traumatic growth have you already started noticing? So please add your idea or response into the chat box, and hopefully Chris will be able to scroll through and see what the positives are. And so just very briefly, I'm just going to explain how post-traumatic growth happens. And you may be familiar with this expression. It's not so much what happens as the meaning you give it. Now people tend to find meaning in life's positive events, readily connecting the event to our pre-existing beliefs. So having a feeling that things are the way they're meant to be, for example, getting the job you've always wanted. But people tend to make meaning from life's negative events. So construct a sense of meaning by asking, by examining what's happened. Why did this happen to me? What does this mean for me? So we make meaning from life's negative events, and that's the way to find the meaning and light the touch fire of post-traumatic growth. So how do we make meaning in a pandemic? Mike Steger is one of the leading researchers on meaning right now, and he describes meaning as having 3 dimensions to it. So there's coherence. Does our life make sense? And the challenge to our sense of coherence is the chaos, the lack of order that the crisis has brought. The new rules for living are unclear. And the solution to that is accept that this is temporary. This too will pass. Things will change and become clearer. Focus instead on what can be controlled, what's within your control. The next dimension to meaning is significance. Does my life feel worthwhile? And the challenge to that is that it is an overwhelming experience, the pandemic, and it can make us feel like we don't matter. So the solution is to reinforce our sense that we do matter, do things to help others, make a contribution in some way. I've just volunteered to help my local surgery to roll out the vaccine, and I'm going to use my professional knowledge as well to help doctors locally to keep going through this crisis. That all feels very meaningful to me. The final dimension of making meaning in the pandemic is to think about, what is your sense of purpose now that our usual route to purpose is blocked. For example, not being able to do the work that we normally do. I'm a trainer, most of my work is face to face, and I've not been able to do that for nearly a year now. Well, I've reinvented it. So invest in a new sense of purpose, even if it's temporary. For example, learn a new skill. I've learned how to deliver training on Zoom, for example. So here are some ways that we can help make meaning in a pandemic. And I'd just like to share with you a beautiful metaphor that explains the process of post-traumatic growth. This comes from Professor Stephen Joseph, who has written a book called What Doesn't Kill Us, in which he came up with this metaphor to explain the process. And it's called the Shuttered Vars metaphor. So imagine a beautiful vase that shatters into 1,000 pieces. What do you do with it? So you can pick up the pieces and glue them back together again. So life looks the same, but it's much more fragile than it was before. So this would be an example of someone, say, someone who's had a health crisis and goes back to work, working at the same pace as they were before. So without changing their worldview. So this is assimilation. You put back life the way it was before. So life looks the same, but it is more fragile. The other way is through accommodation. So take the pieces, and we can relate this to the pandemic, our working lives or our personal lives. Look at the pieces and see how we can put life back together again in a new and different way. What can we do with these shards of life? And it might look different, like a beautiful mosaic, but it will be more robust than it was before. This is the pathway to post-traumatic growth. Break down to break through. Look at the pieces and see what can we make of the shards of life, or what remains after the pandemic. So I'd love to, well, just before, I think we just got a moment before we go on to just talk about the course. Chris, I'd love to know what people have been saying about their own examples of experiencing some of the benefits of post-traumatic growth.
Well, it's really interesting because I've been watching the chat window, and I would say that question has sparked a stronger response than any other question that we've asked in this webinar. There's about 100, or I haven't counted them all, but more than 100 comments, and things like, well, more exercise, more time, more creative, more listening to myself. The discovery of the amazing discovery of Zoom, and that patience, more time for relationships, appreciating friends. I'm more adaptable, more family focused, a closer relationship with my adult daughters, less perfectionism, and someone also put less or no more FOMO, that fear of missing out, and that what I'm seeing there was when we talk about post-traumatic growth, we're not in any way saying it's good that it happened, but a great question is, what good can come from this? What happens is what happens, but it's where we take it and what we do with it is an area where we have some choice. And so what we'll do, by the way, is there was a question of, will the slides be available? And we'll have the slides available on Rizuku, which is the learning platform for our free course. So we'll have them downloadable from the free online course. And we can also have the chat comments there, because it's inspiring reading the many different ways that people have found silver linings in the cloud of the pandemic.
Oh, it's wonderful to hear. And I think it not only does it demonstrate all the 5 different types of benefit that people find or are finding in the crisis, but also lots of examples I notice of strengths, you know, new strengths or strengthened strengths coming through. So, you know, one of the things about resilience is how, you know, crises like this will also strengthen our resilience. It tests us, it strengthens us, it transforms us as well. So I just really hope you hold on to this. This is the light at the end of the tunnel, you know, that there is something positive emerging from the negative as well. So I would like to now just introduce the course. This was a kind of little preview of the course that Chris and I run together. It's a wonderful thing that we do once a year, and it's a good way to start the year, and this year even more than other years as well. So our 8-week course, which goes into much more depth, very practical course. We share lots of evidence-based practices from positive psychology, the science of well-being. And we have a live webinar every Wednesday, and also a learning platform. And on this learning platform, you'll find the replay of the webinar if you can't join us live, and also lots of other resources. And each week we explore a theme. We use the Martin Seligman's PERMA model of well-being as our structure, but we've also got some extra sessions just to sort of reflect other very important ingredients that that contribute to our well-being, like resilience, like mindfulness, and also the physical body, the mind-body connection. So we work our way week by week. Join us live or watch the replay. And the course starts in 2 weeks' time, I think, 27th of January. And there's a week to go. There's an early booking discount, which is open for the next 7 days. So it's a weekly journey to well-being, and a mixture of input, discussion, not quite sure, well, maybe that's the pathway to well-being I can see there. Discussion, we introduce practices within the webinar, and then we invite you to try out some of those practices as your home practice and come back the following week to let us know how you get on. And there's also Rizuka, which is where our current free course is, and there's lots of ways of connecting with other people in the group and other resources as well to help you along the way. And as well as that, there's also, you can catch up with some of the comments that people have shared from previous cohorts. I think you've put some of those onto Rizuka, onto the free course, haven't you, Chris? So,
I sent them out in an email.
Did you? Yeah.
Reminded people of the link for the webinar today.
Right.
For those who booked, also had a link to the last 2 years' comments.
So please do join us, and you're also welcome to join us. We've got another 2 weeks to go of the free online course. So Chris, any closing comments from the chat box or from you?
Just to say, I think we're over people from over 16 countries.
Wow.
And but also many that we may not have caught to. But just I think it's something, I suppose there's a question here. What does it look like to do positive psychology in a time of pandemic? You know, we can know about positive psychology, but it's when we do positive psychology, when we do the practices, that it really makes a difference. And I think it's this thing, whenever we're facing any situation that's challenging, it's like, what do we give to it? And that's really what we're looking at, is what can we give to as our response to the challenges we face in a way that make a better version of 2021 become more likely. And so that's our goal, looking at how do we give our year better foundations in terms of the practices we use. And so one question I'm interested in is, what are you taking away from this webinar? Maybe just really inviting you, if there's anything that you're taking away, perhaps you're more likely to do or less likely to do, that's helpful. When you write it in a chat window, you draw attention to it in a way that others may see too. So that there's Laurie saying, embrace the adversity, knowing that there is a lesson to be learned. And Sharon, share positive thoughts with others. This idea that we can spread positive ripples from what we do. So Gahan, you've got a question. How is positive psychology different from other kind of psychology? I think very broadly, there's some psychologies focus more on what you're moving away from, like psychopathology. Positive psychology is focusing on what is it we want to move towards. And so that's our goal. Well, a great strength to express at this time is punctuality. We've come to the end. It's 8:30.
Oh, okay.
You for some closing comments.
Yeah, thank you. What you just said reminds me that just want to pick up on something that came up in the chat earlier on about the differences between CBT and positive psychology, and they do share some common features, but CBT's focus is on reducing the negative, and positive psychology's focus is on growing the positive, building well-being, learning optimism, cultivating positive emotions, developing positive thinking, for example. So we are, and it is a very proactive approach. I've been working such a long time now in positive psychology, and I've given lots of talks, and sometimes I find that people are interested in positive psychology because it satisfies an intellectual curiosity. But if we want to grow our well-being, we got to go beyond curiosity and put that knowledge into practice. And that's what I love about positive psychology. It is an applied science, and that's what we want to do. We want to, positive psychology is something we do. So we want to share the knowledge, the practices, so that you can grow your own well-being, but also send a positive ripple out into the world at a time when it is very much needed.
What a great sentence to end on. So we just want to wave goodbye and look forward to working with any of you who join the free online course or who join us for the longer, more in-depth course starting on the 27th of January. Bye then.
Bye.